Hello and welcome to another LP Gas Magazine video. I'm Sarah Peacher, digital media content producer for the magazine, and I spoke with Mark Rachal of Cost Management Solutions to discuss supply and demand within the context of the upcoming winter heating season. So when LP Gas spoke with you in the spring, you had some supply-related concerns for this winter. Do you still feel that way?
No, actually, I'm feeling a little better from where we were then. Last time we spoke, we were really seeing a lot of impact on supply that had me concerned. For example, at the beginning of the year, we were at 2.464 million barrels a day of propane production, and that had dropped to 1.932, so a 532,000 barrel drop in production during the probably the worst of COVID. So that was a real concern, and we really weren't seeing the supply side of it drop off nearly as much. So, the demand side drop off nearly as much during that time. So what we were seeing is the supply-demand balance tighten a little bit. We were seeing inventories kind of moving more towards last year, but thankfully, everything's gotten a lot better now. We're really looking good on the inventory side. We're up to almost 98 million barrels, which is 2.5 million barrels more than last year, and really only about 5 million barrels less than our all-time high. So going into winter here, we're looking pretty good.
So how is COVID-19 impacting the propane and overall energy markets today?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that's kind of interesting about the whole, I guess, COVID phenomenon, if you will. The biggest way it really impacts propane is, as you know, propane is really a byproduct of natural gas processing. It is really a byproduct of refining. So if you decrease your crude production and you decrease your natural gas production, you're naturally going to decrease your propane supply and your propane production. And what we're really seeing with COVID is we're really not seeing the demand side for propane come down nearly as much as really the supply side has been impacted by it. For example, so far this year, total domestic demand, which is both the retail side and the petrochemical side, is running about 47,000 barrels a day more than it did last year. For the second half of last winter, which would impact this year's numbers, was pretty weak. So, for us to be ahead on consumption at this point is a little bit surprising. Really, it certainly points to the fact or the possibility that we're getting a lot more demand from the retail side. And if you kind of think about it, why might that be? What are the dynamics that could be at play there? You have all these people that were commuting in and going to work, central business districts, and industrial complexes, and all of this. Now, all of those locations are primarily going to be supplied by natural gas. Okay, so now you say, okay, don't come to work, don't come to this industrial complex, stay at home. So people, they're using, I believe that's the dynamic that's at play here, that we're actually using more propane because we have more people staying at home right now.
Yeah, definitely. With that in mind, what is your advice for propane retailers as we prepare to enter the winter heating season?
Probably the most important thing for us to be talking about right now in the propane industry, and I think most propane retailers can relate to this, but because we have so much supply, and we're actually exporting as much or more propane now than we actually use domestically. And if you think about the way propane supply comes in, it comes in, pretty much the same amount every day, 365 days a year. And unfortunately for retail, we're very seasonal. And so all of the infrastructure that is being put in by our industry is to move propane out of the country via export or to supply the petrochemical industry. And we've had years now in which we're not seeing any investment in the infrastructure to be able to supply the retail side. And this is very concerning. So while we may have a tremendous amount of propane at the hubs, Conway, Mont Belvieu, Marcus Hook, wherever, that does not mean it's going to flow smoothly to an individual market. So while I'm really not concerned, I think we're going to have a very stable pricing environment for the most part. I don't really see crude getting away from us. And by that I mean rising in price. I think it's going to be fairly stable. I think propane prices are going to be fairly stable throughout the year at the hubs. But that does not mean we're not going to have shortages in individual marketplaces. All I can say to propane retail is that you have to understand that the industry, the producers, you used to be the only game in town. So they catered to you. They came to you. They said, we want your business. And you're not seeing that anymore. We're seeing that we're kind of third on the tier, if you will. It's exports, then it's petrochemicals, and then it's us. So as a propane retailer, you have to recognize that you're going to be more responsible for making sure that you have supply to your customers. And that might mean more investment in storage in your local facilities. It might mean teaming up with other retailers to put some sort of rail hub in. But there needs to be more focus on reliable supply from the retail side.
For sure. That's some great advice. Thanks for that. So along with that, can you give us some updates on the other demand sectors of the industry?
Through this point in the year, last year, petrochemicals had used 290,000 barrels a day of propane on average every day. This year, they've used 280,000 barrels a day, so 10,000 barrels a day less. So given that petrochemicals are using less and we're still up 47,000 barrels a day, that tends to say we're using more on the domestic side for the reasons that we've already discussed. Crop drying, I believe, is going to be a non-event. There are several things in play here. I'm not getting any, concerns that, people are chasing for supply or anything like that. Exports, so far this year on the export side, we are running 1.092 million barrels a day compared to 1.049 million barrels a day last year. That's an increase of 43,000 barrels a day. Now while that is up, that is still a lot slower growth than we've been having on the on the export side. I will say this about the exports, and this is something to really keep an eye on in the final quarter of the year and starting into next year. There are some huge plants being built in China. They're propane dehydrogenation plants, and these are plants that take propane and they turn the propane into propylene. And we're talking massive consumptions of propane in these plants. For example, there's one plant that just got completed in China that could use 12 days worth of our U.S. supply in 1 year. It could consume 12 total days of supply. That's a huge amount from one plant. We're going to be looking for in the final quarter here, if we see an uptick in exports I think we're going to continue to see a lot more demand from China. We're just going to have to see how that goes. So that's kind of the lay of the land right now from the different demand sectors at this point.
Yeah, definitely some interesting things to continue watching in the future. So what are you hearing most when it comes to propane supply and pricing issues specifically?
Yeah, so again, we've bounced back on the supply side, which has been great. We're 300,000 barrels a day higher than what we were on the depths of the COVID situation, and that's really helped a lot. It's stabilized everything. So consequently, pricing is very stable. A few months ago, I established this benchmark of 50-cent propane at Mont Belvieu, and so I use that benchmark. And I'm constantly asking myself, okay, is there anything out there that means that tells me we should be going above this benchmark or below this benchmark? And so as I communicate with everyone, clients, customers, whatever, I'm trying to say, hey, I believe we're going to move above that benchmark, or I think we've got the potential to move below that benchmark. Right now, I'm thinking we're stable. I'm still holding to that 50-cent benchmark for Mont Belvieu. And Conway, I think is generally going to run about 5 cents less than that, except right now we're starting, it's very, you know, we're kind of about 3.5, 3.25 cents, where Conway is discounted to Mont Belvieu right now. That's the other thing that we really have to watch. It's very important. There's been a big change in the dynamic of Canadian supply. Of course, that's always been being pushed into the Midwest. And if we look at imports, we had imported 143,000 barrels a day through this point in the year last year, 2019. We're at 112,000 barrels a day this year. So that's 31,000 barrels a day difference this year. Now, at the beginning of the year, Canadian inventory was below normal. It was actually setting 5-year lows, but it's really recovered. It's really shot up. I think it's setting 5-year highs now. So it's not an issue of supply, but we have to remember that Canadian producers now have a lot more options for their propane. It used to be the U.S. market was it, but they're putting trains together to go to Mexico, and they also have export facilities that are being expanded or new export facilities being added on their West Coast to allow them to ship propane to Asia. I think the thing that I probably really would like to talk about in terms of, again, what am I seeing in supply and pricing? It's going to be very easy for us to get lulled into a false sense of security here because we're so well supplied now and all of this kind of thing. So, but what we're really going to be keeping an eye on in the future is this. I'm reading more and more articles about this all the time, and that is a lot of people are forecasting that U.S. crude production has reached its peak, that we may never get back. We were at 13.1 million barrels a day prior to the whole COVID crisis. We're a couple of thousand. We got as much as 2,400 barrels a day off of that, and we recovered a little bit, but we're still 2,000 barrels a day below that. There are a lot of major companies, Shell, BP, major oil companies that are now transitioning away from hydrocarbons. They're starting to kind of move towards renewable energy and that kind of stuff. They're trying to redefine their company. And I don't believe the economics for crude is going to get back to where we're going to see a huge resurgence in crude supply anytime soon. So that is going to be the thing that we're really going to be watching as not so much this winter, but as we move into next year and we start preparing for the next winter. There are some things out there where you can look at it and you can kind of say, yeah, I'm seeing the domestic demand or the demand side for propane staying a lot more stable than the supply side. So if this thing works out, there's some scenarios where you could certainly see that while we've been spoiled for a number of years here with plenty of supply, plenty of inventory, you could see some scenarios out there where that could start tightening up again as we go forward if crude production does not recover. If the sector itself continues to suffer, it could affect our supply long term. And if our demand for propane from these PDH plants, from petrochemicals, and possibly again, if we continue to transition out to the suburbs, maybe we continue to put more pressure on the demand side for propane. So that could tighten things up, put us in a little bit different pricing environment down the road. But I'm not too worried about that for this winter.